Chapter 1. The hollyhocks are always first. Settle in, dear listener. Pour something warm, draw the curtain against the evening, and let me take you somewhere gentler, to a village fete on the last bright Saturday of summer, where the hollyhocks grow taller than the garden fences, and nobody, not one soul among the bunting and the lemonade stalls, suspects that the day will end in a death no one can quite explain. It is the kind of village that postcards are made of, the kind where the church clock is always 5 minutes slow and nobody minds, because nobody is ever in that much of a hurry. Every year on this same Saturday, the green is given over entirely to the Hollyhock Festival, a tradition older than anyone living can properly account for, older even than old Mrs. Pargeter, who claims to remember the first one, though she would have been an infant in arms, and infants, as a rule, remember very little of fates. There are tents the colour of clotted cream and raspberry jam. There is a brass band that has played the same 6 tunes for as long as anyone can recall, and plays them with the same cheerful indifference to key. There are jars of chutney lined up like soldiers awaiting judgment, and a vicar attempting, with limited success, to auction off a homemade fruitcake to a crowd that has already eaten 3 slices of it for free. And there are the hollyhocks themselves, tall, papery, gently swaying things, pink and crimson and the soft yellow of old butter, lining the path from the lich gate to the festival green, like an honour guard that has stood there for generations and asks nothing of anyone except to be admired once a year. It is, in short, a perfectly ordinary, perfectly lovely English afternoon, which is precisely the sort of afternoon in which something terrible has every opportunity to happen, and almost always does. The first small wrongness, and there is always a first small wrongness, dear listener, long before anyone calls it a clue, comes not from the green at all, but from the walled garden behind the old rectory, where Edith Calloway, the festival's long-standing committee chair, keeps her prize hollyhocks under lock and careful watch. She has grown them for 11 years running. She has won the festival's modest silver cup for 9 of them, and this year, for the first time anyone can remember, she is heard, quite clearly, by the curate's young wife, who happens to be cutting through the garden with a tray of scones, arguing with someone, not loudly, not for long, but arguing, in the low, clipped tones people use when they very much do not wish to be overheard, and are nonetheless determined to win. You'll say nothing, Edith is heard to say. Not today, not ever, if you've any decency left in you. The curate's wife does not see who she is speaking to. She assumes, reasonably enough, that it is nothing, a small domestic disagreement, the sort every village absorbs and forgets by tea time. She continues on with her scones. It is only much later, once everything has gone quite wrong, that she will mention it to anyone at all, and by then it will matter terribly. The social fabric of a village fete is a deceptively delicate thing, dear listener. On the surface it is all good humour and homemade jam, but beneath it runs a current of old grievances, old debts, old loves gone sour, all of it dressed up in cardigans and sensible shoes and smiling. There is Major Whitfield, retired and restless, who has run the tombola for 15 years and resents, with a quiet and corrosive bitterness, that he was never once asked to chair the committee. There is Rosalind Fairfax, newly arrived from London, whose easy charm has made her popular with the men of the village and deeply unpopular with their wives. There is Tom Aldis, the young gardener who tends Edith Calloway's prize hollyhocks for her, a boy of perhaps 24, with dirt under his nails and something unspoken behind his eyes. And there is Dr. Mercer, the village physician, who attends every fete with his black bag close at hand, more out of habit than necessity, for nothing has ever truly gone wrong at a hollyhock festival, until this one. The afternoon proceeds, as afternoons of this kind always do, in a gentle accumulation of small moments. A coconut won, and immediately regifted, a child's balloon escaping into the elms, a brief and entirely unnecessary disagreement over the correct way to slice a Victoria sponge. The sun moves with unhurried grace across the green. The brass band finishes its 6th tune and begins with evident relief, its first, And then, at 20 minutes past 4, in front of nearly the whole village, Edith Calloway, chair of the committee, grower of prize hollyhocks, keeper of at least one very interesting secret, collapses beside the lemonade stall, knocks over a jug of her own homemade cordial in doing so, and does not get up again. Chapter 2. A Jug of Lemonade. For a moment, dear listener, no one moves at all. That is always the way of it. The heart understands before the body does, and the body simply stands there, teacup in hand, refusing to believe what the eyes have already accepted. It is Dr. Mercer who reaches her first. He kneels in the grass in his good festival suit without a thought for the stains, and for perhaps 30 seconds, though it feels, to those watching, very much longer, he says nothing at all. When he finally looks up, his face has the particular stillness of a man choosing his next words with great care. "Someone fetch a blanket," he says, "and keep the children back." It is not, on its own, an alarming sentence, but something in the way he says it, quiet, level, entirely without the usual brisk reassurance of a country doctor, tells the gathering crowd that this is not a faint, not the heat, not too much sun, and too much sponge cake. Edith Calloway is dead before the church clock, 5 minutes slow, as ever, strikes 4:30. The jug of lemonade lies overturned in the grass beside her, its contents already soaking into the lawn, and it is this detail, more than any other, that lodges itself in the minds of everyone present, though none of them could yet say why. It is, after all, only lemonade. Edith's lemonade, in fact, famous throughout the village, made each year to her own closely guarded recipe, served only from her own jug, poured only by her own hand. No one else, by long-standing and rather endearing tradition, is permitted to touch it. Which means, dear listener, that whatever was in that jug, Edith put there herself, or someone wished, very much, for it to appear that way. Dr. Mercer will say later, in the careful language doctors use when they do not wish to alarm, that he cannot account for the death by natural means alone, and that certain things, the colour about her lips, the particular rigidity already setting into her hands, give him pause. He will say this quietly, to the constable who arrives some 40 minutes later on his bicycle, slightly out of breath and entirely unprepared for a death of this kind, in a village where the most serious crime in living memory was the theft of a prize marrow. The festival does not so much end as simply stop, the way a clock stops, mid-tick, mid-tune, the brass band's 7th song abandoned halfway through its 2nd bar. Tents remain standing, bunting still flutters, absurdly cheerful, over a green from which all the cheer has quite gone. Villagers stand about in small, murmuring clusters, the way people do when something has happened that none of them yet have the proper words for. It is in one such cluster that the first true unease begins to surface. Not suspicion, not yet, but the slow uncoiling of a thought that none of them wishes to be first to say aloud. Mrs. Pargeter, who remembers, or claims to remember, every festival there has ever been, says it eventually in the flat, unhurried way of the very old, who have long since stopped being frightened of saying true things. "She's been poisoned," she says. "Mark me, I've seen a face like that before, and it weren't from the heat." No one contradicts her. No one quite agrees either, but the word poisoned settles over the green like a held breath, and from that moment forward, every kindness shown to Edith Calloway over the years, every grudge nursed quietly against her, every small unkindness she ever gave or received, becomes, suddenly and irrevocably, a matter of consequence. The curate's wife, white-faced, finally mentions the argument in the walled garden, to her husband first, in a whisper, and then, with visible reluctance, to the constable. "You'll say nothing, not today, not ever, if you've any decency left in you." She cannot say who Edith was speaking to. She did not see. But she is quite certain of the words, and quite certain, too, of the fear underneath them, for it had not, she says, sounded like anger so much as warning. By the time the light begins to soften toward evening, gold going to amber across the green, the Hollyhock festival has quietly become something else entirely, not a death, but a question. And questions, dear listener, in villages such as this one, have a way of unearthing far more than anyone bargained for. Chapter 3. Old grudges wear cardigans. By the following morning, the green has been cleared of bunting and replaced, in the way of small places, with something far harder to remove: talk. It travels the way these things always do, over garden fences, across the post office counter, in the unhurried queue outside the baker's, not as accusation, never quite that, but as the gentle, devastating art of wondering aloud. Mrs. Pargeter wonders, to anyone who will listen, why Rosalind Fairfax was seen near the lemonade stall not 20 minutes before the collapse. Someone else wonders why Major Whitfield left the tombola unattended for the better part of an hour, quite unlike him, given how jealously he guards that small post of authority. And nearly everyone eventually returns to the matter of young Tom Aldis, who tends Edith's prize hollyhocks, and who was seen, more than once that afternoon, looking at her with an expression no one can quite name, though several attempt to. It falls, in the absence of any proper detective, to a quiet, watchful woman of advancing years and unhurried habits, a long-time friend of the village, well known for her interest in wool, her interest in birds, and her apparently limitless interest in other people's business, to do what villagers of this kind have always relied upon someone to do, to listen, properly, to everything that is said, and everything that is carefully left unsaid. She begins, as she always does, with tea, taken on this occasion in the kitchen of the curate's wife, who is still pale, still shaken, and rather relieved to have someone calm to talk to. You're quite certain of the words, the old woman says, not as a question. Quite certain, says the curate's wife. You'll say nothing. Not today, not ever if you've any decency left in you. I've turned it over and over. It wasn't anger, you understand. It was fear. Edith was frightened of whoever she was speaking to. This is, dear listener, the sort of detail that changes everything, and changes nothing, for it tells us a great deal about Edith Calloway's state of mind, and almost nothing at all about who stood opposite her in that walled garden. The afternoon brings further small fragments, each one polite, each one devastating in its own quiet way. Rosalind Fairfax, when asked, admits without hesitation that she was near the lemonade. She had gone, she says, to refill her own glass, and found Edith already there, in a state, though Rosalind could not say over what. She had thought it nothing more than festival nerves. Major Whitfield, for his part, grows distinctly uncomfortable when his absence from the tombola is mentioned, and changes the subject twice before admitting, with visible reluctance, that he had gone to have a word with Edith about the committee's accounts. A word, he insists, that had nothing whatsoever to do with poison, and everything to do with a sum of money he believes was never properly recorded. And then there is Tom Aldis, who says almost nothing at all, and whose silence, in its own way, says rather more than the other's words combined. He loved those flowers more than she did, Mrs. Pargeter remarks, watching the boy from a distance as he kneels, that same afternoon, in the walled garden, tending hollyhocks that no longer have anyone left to win prizes for. Strange thing, to love a flower more than its owner does. It is a small observation, offered without malice, and yet it lodges itself, as the best clues always do, quietly, and refuses to be dislodged. By evening, Dr. Mercer's preliminary findings have begun, discreetly, to circulate, not a heart failing under summer heat, but something administered, something bitter, easily masked by the sharpness of good lemonade, something that does not announce itself until it is very much too late to undo. The cause of death, he says carefully, will need to wait upon a proper examination, but he no longer believes, and says so plainly, that Edith Calloway died of anything the good Lord intended. The village, by nightfall, has stopped pretending otherwise. Chapter 4. What the jug could not have done alone. There is a particular quiet that falls over a village once it has admitted, fully and finally, that one of its own has been murdered. Dear listener, it is not the quiet of grief alone. Grief, in its way, is generous. it allows weeping and remembering and the bringing of casseroles. This is a different quiet, a watchful one, the quiet of neighbours who have begun, without quite wishing to look at one another differently across the garden fence. The post-mortem confirms what Dr. Mercer suspected and dreaded in equal measure. Edith Calloway was poisoned, and not by accident, and not by her own hand. The substance, bitter, fast-acting, easily disguised beneath the sharpness of fresh lemon and sugar, had been present in sufficient quantity to leave no room for any kinder explanation. It had been in the lemonade, specifically in the jug. And the jug, as the whole village well knows, was touched by no hand but Edith's own, filled by her that morning, in her own kitchen, carried by her own hands to the festival green, and poured, throughout the long warm afternoon, only by her. Which means, dear listener, and here is the clue upon which everything else must turn, that whatever was added to that jug was added either before Edith ever left her kitchen, or during one of the brief moments that afternoon when the jug stood unattended on the trestle table, while Edith herself was elsewhere on the green, greeting guests, judging marrows, arguing, however briefly, with someone in a walled garden who wished, very much, that she would say nothing. The old woman, with her wool and her birds and her unhurried curiosity, takes this fact and turns it over, with the same patience she might give a difficult piece of knitting. When was the jug unattended? Who knew it would be? And most tellingly of all, who, in this village, would have had both the opportunity to tamper with it and the particular kind of knowledge required to know that a bitter poison could be masked, almost entirely, by the sharpness of good lemonade? It is Dr. Mercer himself who first raises this last point, with evident discomfort, for it is a piece of knowledge that belongs, properly, to very few people in the village. A doctor, certainly, a chemist, had the village possessed one, which it does not. And, as it happens, anyone who has spent any portion of their life working closely with plants, for it is precisely the sort of bitter, fast-acting substance that grows, quite legally and quite commonly, in any number of English gardens, provided one knows where to look, and how much to use, and how cleverly to hide it. This observation settles, inevitably and uncomfortably, upon young Tom Aldis, who tends Edith's garden, who knows her plants better than she ever did herself, and who said almost nothing at all on the day of her death. But the old woman is not yet satisfied, and says so, gently, over a second cup of tea with the curate's wife. It is a very great mistake, she says, to assume that the person with the most obvious knowledge must therefore be the person who used it. Gardens, after all, are not secret. Anyone who has spent an afternoon in Edith Calloway's garden, and a great many people have, over the years, admiring her hollyhocks, might have learned more than they ever meant to. It is at this point that a second small wrongness surfaces, smaller than the first, easily overlooked, and yet, once noticed, impossible to set aside. Rosalind Fairfax, newly arrived from London, is discovered, quite by accident, by the postmistress, who is not in the habit of gossip, but cannot help noticing such things, to have written, some weeks before the festival, to a solicitor regarding the contents of a will, not her own. Edith Calloway's. It is the sort of detail that, on its own, proves nothing at all. People write to solicitors about all manner of things, and Edith Calloway, as committee chair and a woman of modest but real property, was entitled to make whatever arrangements she pleased with whoever she pleased. But it is the timing, dear listener, that gives the old woman pause, for it suggests, however faintly, that someone in this village knew something about Edith Calloway's affairs, long before the rest of the village ever thought to ask. Major Whitfield's word about the committee's accounts, too, refuses to settle quietly. A discrepancy is found, small, easily explained, the sort of clerical slip that happens in any small organisation run by well-meaning amateurs, but a discrepancy nonetheless, and one that Edith, by all accounts, had discovered some weeks earlier and said nothing about to anyone until the day she died. The chapter closes, as the best chapters of this kind of story always do, not with an answer, but with a deepening, 3 separate threads, each pulling gently in a different direction, each refusing, for now, to meet. Chapter 5. Everyone is very sorry, and everyone is lying a little. It is a curious feature of village life, dear listener, that grief and suspicion can occupy the very same room without ever quite acknowledging one another. The funeral, held on a soft grey Wednesday with the church bells muffled out of respect, is attended by nearly everyone. Rosalind Fairfax in unimpeachable black, Major Whitfield standing rather too straight at the back, Tom Aldis, hat in hand, refusing to meet anyone's eye, and Dr. Mercer, grave and watchful, observing the gathering with the particular attentiveness of a man who has begun, privately, to suspect that the answer he seeks is standing somewhere in this very church. The old woman attends too, of course, though she says very little, and watches a great deal. For funerals, she has long believed, reveal a village's true feelings far more honestly than any amount of polite conversation over tea. She notices, for instance, that Rosalind Fairfax weeps, genuinely by the look of it, and that this surprises several people who had assumed on no particular evidence beyond her London manners and her easy charm that Rosalind cared little for Edith at all. She notices that Major Whitfield does not weep, but stands with the rigid discomfort of a man working very hard at composure, and that his eyes, more than once, drift toward Tom Aldis, who stands apart from the others entirely, as though the church itself has decided he does not quite belong inside it. Afterwards, over tea taken at the curate's table, for the old woman has found, over many years and many small village tragedies, that nothing loosens a tongue so gently as a fresh pot and an unhurried silence. The threads begin, very slowly, to draw closer together. It transpires that Rosalind Fairfax's letter to the solicitor was not, as several had assumed, an inquiry into Edith's will at all, but something rather sadder. Rosalind, it emerges with some reluctance, is Edith Calloway's estranged niece, the daughter of a sister long since fallen out of the family's good graces, and her arrival in the village some months earlier had nothing to do with charm or conquest, but with a quiet, anxious hope of reconciliation, a hope Edith, by all accounts, had been on the very brink of returning, before her death cut the matter short. The solicitor's letter concerned not an inheritance pursued, but a reunion, tentatively, painfully hoped for. She was going to forgive me, Rosalind says, and there is no performance in it at all. She told me as much. The week before the festival, she said we'd talk properly. After, she never got the chance to. It is, dear listener, exactly the sort of revelation that ought to clear a suspect entirely, and very nearly does, except that the old woman, listening with her usual unhurried attention, notices that Rosalind has not in fact accounted for the 20 minutes she spent unsupervised near the lemonade jug, only for her reasons for being there. Major Whitfield, for his part, proves rather less sympathetic in his explanations. The discrepancy in the committee accounts, when finally laid bare, amounts to some £40, quietly diverted over the better part of a year, not a fortune, but enough, in a village of this size, to ruin a reputation built over 15 years of tombolas and church fêtes. Edith had found it. Edith had said nothing to anyone but him, and had given him, he admits with evident shame, exactly 1 week to put the matter right before she brought it to the rest of the committee. The festival fell on the 6th day of that week. I didn't kill her, Major Whitfield says, and there is real fear in it now, not composure at all. I was angry. God knows I was angry, but I never touched that jug. And Tom Aldis, quiet, watchful Tom Aldis, who has said almost nothing throughout, finally speaks, when the old woman finds him alone in the walled garden that evening, kneeling once more among the hollyhocks that no longer have an owner to tend them for. She wasn't going to give me the garden, he says, without being asked anything at all. Everyone assumes I loved those flowers. I loved this garden. She'd promised it to me. When she was gone, I mean in her will, the cottage and the plot both, because I'd no family of my own, and she knew I'd nowhere else to grow anything properly. And then she changed her mind. Because of Rosalind, because family, she said, ought to come before hired help, however fond she was of me. It is the most he has said since the day Edith died, and the old woman listens to every word of it with an expression that gives away nothing at all, though something in it, dear listener, has finally begun, very quietly, to make sense. Chapter 6. The Argument in the Walled Garden. A clue, dear listener, is rarely a single bright object glittering on the ground, waiting to be found. More often, it is something already known, already heard, already half forgotten, waiting only to be understood properly, in its proper order, beside the things that surround it. And so it is, now, with the argument the curate's wife overheard in the walled garden on the very afternoon Edith Calloway died. You'll say nothing, not today, not ever, if you've any decency left in you. The old woman returns to these words again and again, turning them gently in her mind, the way one turns a stitch that has gone subtly wrong, searching for the precise point at which the pattern first slipped. It is not anger, the curate's wife had said. It was fear. And fear, dear listener, is rarely directed at a stranger. One does not generally fear the person one barely knows. One fears, instead, the person who already knows a great deal, perhaps too much, and might at any moment choose to say it. The old woman returns once more to Tom Aldis's confession in the walled garden. She'd promised me the garden, and then she changed her mind, and asks him, gently, a question no one has yet thought to ask. When did she tell you of her change of mind? The morning of the festival, he says, before any of the stalls were even set up. She came to find me in the garden, early, before anyone else was about, and told me plainly the will would change, because of Rosalind, because family came first. I was angry. I told her so. I told her it wasn't fair, after everything I'd... He stops. It wasn't me she was arguing with after that. Whatever the curate's wife heard later, it wasn't me. I'd already had my say, and gone off to sulk by the marrow tent, if you want the truth of it. It is, the old woman notes, an answer that fits rather better than it ought to for a man still under suspicion, for if Tom's confrontation occurred early in the morning, then the argument the curate's wife overheard, which took place much later, in the early afternoon, must have involved someone else entirely, someone who came to the walled garden later in the day, someone who already knew something Edith very much did not wish repeated. It is here that the old woman, with her tea growing cold and her wool quite forgotten in her lap, returns to a detail mentioned almost in passing some days earlier, and never properly examined since. Major Whitfield's £40, discovered by Edith some weeks before the festival, and the 1-week deadline she had given him to set it right. The deadline, by the old woman's careful reckoning, fell precisely on the day of the festival itself. She finds Major Whitfield in his garden, attending to roses he does not, in truth, much care for, and asks him a question with the same unhurried gentleness she has used throughout. Did you go to her, that afternoon, to tell her the money had been returned? He is silent for a long moment. I went to tell her I needed more time, he says finally. I hadn't the full sum yet. I'd managed perhaps half of it, and I begged her, yes, begged, I'm not ashamed to say it now, though I was ashamed enough at the time, to give me another fortnight before she brought it to the committee. She refused. She told me plainly that if I didn't make it right by the day's end, she'd say nothing more about second chances, and everyone would know precisely what kind of man I'd turned out to be. You'll say nothing, the old woman thinks. Not today, not ever, if you've any decency left in you. It fits the words almost perfectly, and yet, dear listener, something in the old woman's expression does not settle into satisfaction, but only into a deeper, more careful stillness. For a confrontation overheard, however well it fits, is not yet a poisoning explained. Major Whitfield had motive and opportunity enough to argue. But the lemonade jug, by every account given so far, stood unattended on the trestle table for the better part of only 10 unsupervised minutes that whole long afternoon, and Major Whitfield, by his own admission, and by 3 independent witnesses at the tombola, was nowhere near the lemonade stall during that particular window at all. Someone else was. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Bag, and a Letter Never Sent It, is, dear listener, always the smallest discrepancy that unravels the largest deception, a window of 10 minutes, carefully accounted for by nearly everyone, save one person whose presence near the lemonade that afternoon has, until now, gone almost entirely unremarked, precisely because his presence at any village gathering is so thoroughly unremarkable as to be invisible. Dr. Mercer. It is not, the old woman is careful to note, that suspicion falls upon him through any failing of his evidence. His post-mortem findings have been, throughout, scrupulously honest, perhaps more honest than was strictly comfortable for him. It is, rather, that honesty itself, examined closely enough, can sometimes reveal more than the person offering it ever intended. The old woman recalls a small remark, made almost in passing, on the very afternoon of Edith's death. Someone fetch a blanket and keep the children back. Spoken not with the brisk authority of a man encountering an unexpected emergency, but with the quiet, settled calm of a man who already understood, with terrible clarity, precisely what he was looking at. She recalls, too, that it was Dr. Mercer who first suggested, gently and specifically, that the poison used was of the kind any keen gardener might cultivate, a remark that pointed, however unintentionally, directly toward Tom Aldis, and away from anyone else who might also possess such knowledge by training rather than by trowel. And she recalls, finally, the postmistress's small observation, offered without malice, and very nearly forgotten, that a letter, addressed to Edith Calloway in Dr. Mercer's own hand, had been returned to him unsent some 3 weeks before the festival, the postmistress having noticed only that he seemed unusually flustered upon retrieving it from where it sat, unposted, in the village's small collection of undelivered correspondence. A letter never sent is, dear listener, very often more revealing than a letter that was. The old woman finds Dr. Mercer in his consulting room that evening, his black bag closed upon his desk, his expression the particular stillness of a man who has long suspected this conversation was coming and has, in his own quiet way, been dreading it. You attended Edith Calloway as her physician for many years, the old woman says, settling herself into the chair across from him without being asked. I did. And in that time, I imagine, you came to know a great deal about her health, her habits, her medicines, and her ailments, and which of the latter she preferred to keep private, even from her closest friends. He does not answer at once. There was a diagnosis, he says finally, some months ago, one she asked me, very particularly, never to share with anyone, not the committee, not her niece, not a soul in this village, a condition that would, in time, have ended her life regardless, and not gently. And the letter, says the old woman, the one returned unsent, was that a confession of the diagnosis, doctor, or something else? His hands, the old woman notices, are entirely still upon the desk, in the manner of a man who has decided, after long deliberation, that there is no longer any profit in concealment. It was an offer, he says. I had grown fonder of her over the years than a physician strictly ought to grow of a patient. I wrote to tell her so, and to tell her, too, that whatever time she had left, she needn't spend any part of it alone if she didn't wish to. I lost my nerve before I ever sent it. I am, I'm afraid, rather a coward in matters of the heart, however steady my hand may be in matters of medicine. It is, dear listener, a confession of love, not of murder, and the old woman, watching him carefully, believes him entirely, for there is a particular kind of grief in his voice that cannot easily be performed. But it confirms, beyond any further doubt, one essential fact. Dr. Mercer knew, weeks before anyone else, that Edith Calloway was dying already, slowly, privately, on her own diminishing terms, which raises, at last, the question the old woman has been circling, gently and patiently, since the very first afternoon. If Edith Calloway was already dying, quietly, on terms of her own choosing, then why, dear listener, would anyone trouble themselves to poison a jug of lemonade in front of half the village, in the clumsiest, most public, most easily discovered manner imaginable, unless, of course, the poisoning was never meant to kill her at all? Chapter 8. What the lemonade was truly for. It is, dear listener, the quiet turn upon which the very best of these mysteries always pivot. The moment one stops asking who could have done this terrible thing, and begins, instead, asking the rather different question of what, precisely, was this terrible thing actually meant to accomplish. The old woman returns, that evening, to the walled garden, empty now but for the hollyhocks themselves, tall and unconcerned, swaying gently in the early evening air, exactly as they have swayed every summer for years beyond counting, and there she finally allows the separate threads of the last week to settle, quietly and completely, into their proper places. Edith Calloway was dying already. Dr. Mercer alone knew it, and had told no one, not even, it transpires upon gentle questioning, Edith's own solicitor, for she had asked that the matter remain entirely private until she herself chose to disclose it. But there was one person, the old woman now understands, to whom Edith very nearly had disclosed it, on the morning of the festival, in the walled garden, before any of the stalls were yet assembled. Not Tom Aldis, whose confrontation that morning concerned the will alone. Someone else, who came to the garden afterward, and who the curate's wife heard arguing with Edith in the early afternoon, an argument the old woman had, until this moment, attributed entirely to Major Whitfield's £40. She returns to the curate's wife's account, word for word, with new and careful attention. You'll say nothing. Not today, not ever, if you've any decency left in you. It is, the old woman now realises, not the sentence of a man defending stolen money at all, for Major Whitfield, by his own admission, had begged for time, not demanded silence. It is, instead, precisely the sentence of someone defending a secret belonging to someone else, a secret Edith herself wished, on this last festival of her life, to keep from spreading beyond the walled garden until she was ready. The old woman returns, at last, to Rosalind Fairfax, not as a suspect now, but as a witness to something she herself may not have fully understood. Your aunt told you, the week before the festival, that you would talk properly, after, the old woman says gently, finding Rosalind in the small cottage she has taken on the village's edge. Did she say, after what, precisely? Rosalind frowns, turning the memory over, as though for the first time. After the festival, I assumed. She said there was something she needed to settle first, something about the garden, and about Tom, that she wanted resolved before she could give her attention properly to me. I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was only fairness, wanting to deal with one matter before starting another. And on the afternoon she died, the old woman says, did you, by any chance, see her speaking with anyone in the walled garden, after Tom, I mean, but before she collapsed? Rosalind is quiet for a long moment. I saw her with the vicar, she says finally. I didn't think it odd at the time. She was the committee chair after all, and they often spoke about parish matters. But now you ask it plainly. She looked frightened, talking to him. I remember thinking it was strange, and then I forgot it entirely, because of everything that happened after. The vicar. It is, dear listener, the figure so thoroughly woven into the fabric of village life that he had become, to every witness present, entirely invisible, present at every gathering, trusted by every soul, and consequently never once considered by anyone, including the old woman herself, until this very moment. She recalls now a detail offered in passing, days earlier, by the curate's wife herself, and never examined for what it truly was, that the vicar had been attempting, that very afternoon, to auction off a homemade fruitcake, a fruitcake, as it happens, made not by the vicar's own wife, as everyone had assumed, but supplied that very morning by Edith Calloway herself, that delivered personally to the rectory kitchen, where it had sat, alongside the lemonade jug, for the vicar, in his enthusiasm for the festival, had offered to store both items safely in the cool of the rectory pantry until the stalls were ready, returning them to the green himself, by hand, not 20 minutes before the festival opened. It is the one unsupervised window the old woman has been searching for from the very beginning, not 10 minutes on the trestle table, as everyone assumed, but nearly 2 unwatched hours in the rectory pantry, where the jug sat entirely alone, in the keeping of a man no one had thought, even once, to suspect. Chapter 9. A quiet word with the vicar. The old woman finds the vicar, that same evening, in the small, book-lined study of the rectory, a cup of tea, cooling untouched at his elbow, his hands folded with the particular composure of a man who has spent his whole life learning how to appear calm, regardless of what is happening underneath. "You stored the lemonade in your pantry that morning," she says, without preamble, settling herself into the chair opposite, along with the fruitcake. "I did," he says. "It seemed only practical. The pantry is cool, and the green was a great deal of bustle that early. And Edith came to find you there, in the walled garden, that afternoon, not to discuss parish business, as everyone assumed, but because she had learnt something about her own diagnosis, which she had told no one but Dr. Mercer, Thames." The vicar is silent for a long moment. "She came to tell me she was dying," he says finally, very quietly. "She wished the parish to know, in time, in her own way, and she asked for my counsel on how best to say it when the time came, a final sermon perhaps, or a letter to be read after." It was a private conversation between a woman facing her own mortality and the man she trusted to help her face it with some grace. I told her she needn't say anything at all if she didn't wish to. I told her it was hers to keep for as long as she chose. And yet the curate's wife heard you tell her, quite firmly, that she must say nothing. Not today, not ever, if she had any decency left in her. That is not the language of comfort, vicar. That is the language of a man protecting something of his own. It is here, dear listener, that the vicar's composure, built over years of careful practice, finally, quietly gives way. There was more she had learned, he says at last, beyond her own diagnosis. Dr. Mercer had told her something else, in confidence, weeks earlier, not about her health, but about mine. A weakness I have struggled with for some years, dear listener, that I will not dignify by naming precisely, save to say that it had, on one occasion the previous winter, cost the parish funds I should never have touched, and which I repaid in full before anyone but Edith and the doctor ever knew of it. She had forgiven me the money. She had never quite forgiven me the lie I told to cover it, and on the morning of the festival, weighing her own mortality, she told me she intended, before she died, to set every account in the village right, Major Whitfield's, Tom's, mine, all of it, so that she might go to her grave with nothing left unsettled. "And so you went to the pantry," the old woman says, very gently now, for she has seen many times before the particular grief of a good man who has done one terrible thing for reasons he still half believes were merciful, and you ensured that she never had the chance to settle anything at all. He does not deny it. He does not, in truth, even attempt to. "I never meant her real harm," he says, and there are tears now, quite unguarded. "I meant only to frighten her, a little bitterness in the jug, enough to make her unwell, enough to delay her, to buy myself time to think, to find some other way to make amends before the truth came out. I did not know, I swear before God I did not know, quite how weak her heart already was, nor how much more the substance would do to a body already failing. I thought I was buying myself a fortnight. I did not understand I was ending a life that had, in any case, so very little time left to it. It is not, dear listener, the confession of a calculating murderer at all, but something sadder and far more human, a desperate, cowardly act committed by a frightened man against a dying woman who had, in her last private kindness, intended only to set him free. The constable is sent for. The vicar does not resist, does not flee, does not even ask for leniency, only sits, quite still, in the chair where he has spent so many years offering comfort to others, now finally and fully undone by the truth of his own smallest, gravest failure.